Okay, thank you so much, Anna. And I'd like to thank Anna and Peter and Scott for having me here as part of the lecture series. It's a pleasure to be here and see you all. And so I'm going to share my screen now. Hold on for a second. There we go. Okay, do you see the presenter view?
Yes.
That's not what I had in mind. Let's see how I can.
No, we see.
We
see
the presentation. Yes.
Okay, just the presentation. That's good. Thank you. Okay, so yes, so I'm pleased to talk about a very central topic in gesture research and a difficult topic, iconicity. And I call this talk Augmented Iconicity because mocap technology allows us to augment the visual character of gesture. And so that's my main point today, to show you how this is possible. And so I'm going to first give you a very brief overview of the theoretical framework that I'm using and I'm constantly further developing. And then I'm going to give a little tour of the Natural Media Lab in terms of the studies that fit this idea of augmented iconicity. I will show you a little bit how mocap allows us to capture and visualize and analyze communicative body movements and to give us new insights that can then feed back into theory building. So my first focus will be image iconicity in gestural descriptions of artworks by Paul Klee. Then I'm going to look at diagrammatic iconicity in gestures playing an active role in dialogic travel planning. So that's more schematic in terms of evoking certain underlying maps. And then the third focus is metaphor iconicity in gestures reflecting more abstract construal processes and aspectual framing. So you can see that this is already, this reflects Peirce's different kinds of iconicity, image, diagram, and metaphor. So just to give you a first introduction, also for those of you who are not gesture scholars or not yet. So I wanted to just briefly mention some of the theoretical empirical goals that I find particularly interesting. So first of all, we would like to find patterns in gestural movements. And so, so we look at gestures which are relatively free or idiosyncratic bodily movements to communicate. They are less conventionalized than language. And we would like to find patterns of hand configurations and movements across speakers and contexts. That is a big goal of gesture research. And our work can give can provide a contribution to this using our theory and our methods. And you can see on the right-hand side an example of the palm open hand, which was described by Cornelia Müller and by Jana Bressem and Cornelia Müller as a recurrent gesture. And so that means that these highly frequent gestures can be analyzed across the use of individuals and languages, and that's particularly interesting. And so we are looking for empirical insights into cognitive, linguistic, sociocultural, and action-based foundations of human multimodal communication and interaction. And the theoretical interest that I have, and I'm not the only one, of course, some of our colleagues are present here in the audience who have a similar interest, is to understand the embodied mind. And from my perspective, this is particularly relevant to the cognitive semiotic principles that motivate, structure, and regulate observable patterns of gestural behavior. So what kinds of principles motivate gestures and lend some regularity to gestures? And of course, the obvious suspects here in terms of cognitive linguistics are embodied image schemas, force dynamics, frames, iconicity, metonymy. There's a large body of research on all of these different principles and processes. And what I find particularly interesting is that in gestures and in the meaning of gestural signs, you have some observable elements of a gesture, and then you have less visible aspects of gesture, even though gestures called also like a visual language. Well, there are a lot of things in gestural communication that are not visible, like the movement trace that my hand movement leaves in the air, or I talk about objects and they are not present, but I can make them present through my gestures in a certain way. So, and then they have these traces, and these objects that we seem to be dealing with or handling, they need to be inferred metonymically. So I don't have the time to talk much about gesture, but metonymy and gesture, but that is, of course, very much linked to iconicity in gesture. So if we now look at a typical example that we all know from the literature, and going back to McNeil's work and Fay Perel's work, we have these typical iconic gestures representing some kind of motion event from a cartoon story. And in his later writings in 2005, McNeil prefers the term iconicity over iconics, and saying that iconicity is a dimension of gestures. And as we all know, gestures have multiple dimensions and functions, and so this is putting a focus on the iconic nature of certain gestures. And they also can combine character viewpoint and observer viewpoint. So I can describe a scene as if I was the character from the inside of the scene, or I can pretend to observe a scene. And here this person here, the speaker, is imitating the manner of the movement with his legs, and he's tracing the path of the movement trajectory into the air. And so he combines these two viewpoints, and iconicity in gesture is also highly intertwined with viewpoint mechanisms. Now, I would like to show that, of course, building on this kind of work, that motion capture technology can visualize these traces. And that's something that we find particularly interesting, because we can then look at the movement trajectory and quality and learn more about the actual trace. And sometimes that is actually surprising, because just from looking at the video, we do have a certain idea of a movement. And if you look at this movement in detail, it's not as regular or schematic as it looks like in the movement. So that's one point that I would like to further develop in this talk. And with the video, you have as here, you have the focus on the bodily posture and the action. And with the mocap, well, this is now the mocap trace superimposed onto the video, but you can also just look at the trace, and then you do not see the speaker, as I will show you later. So that can shift the focus from the speaker and the personal traits of the feature of the speaker, the age and gender and so forth, and you can really then zoom in on the gestural gestalt. Okay, so now the theoretical foundation, very briefly. Of course, some of you already have a good understanding of this. So I just would like to remind us of the original definition of Peirce. How did he define iconicity? And I quote, "Icons have qualities which resemble those of the objects they represent, and they excite analogous sensations in the mind." And for those of us who are cognitive linguists, this is quite interesting, because this sounds very cognitive, and it's, you have sensations, you have the mind, and sign processes also, according to Peirce, are combined semiosis and the material sign carrier, and of course also the cognitive reaction in the mind of the interpreter. So it's, according to Peirce, the similarity, which is a disputed notion also in gesture research. I cannot go into detail here, and also iconicity. But in Peircean terms, the similarity is perceived by the sign user. We see similarity between a sign and the object. And sometimes we don't, because we don't have the background knowledge to make that connection. And what's also interesting is that Peirce's understanding of objects is very wide, and it ranges from existing to non-existing things, possibilities, goals, qualities, and so forth. So that means anything can be part of a gestural sign process, you know, as long as a sign user makes that possible. And this entails then different kinds of iconicity and also metaphoricity. And sometimes it's really difficult to say whether a certain gesture is only iconic or already metaphoric. And very often we have to look at the concurrent speech to find out what kind of process is actually involved. So, so very, very quickly here, this is Peirce, but I just wanted to say that this is similarity and iconicity up there. And then I'm going to look at image iconicity, diagram, and metaphor iconicity as subtypes of iconicity. And this also helps me to structure my talk. So in my work, I combine the theories by Charles Sanders Peirce, Roman Jakobsen, and cognitive linguistics. They all have share common ground. This is how I then look at the cognitive semiotic principles of multimodal sign constitution interpretation. And this understanding also helps me to look at other multimodal manifestations or forms of communication. So now I would like to move into the more empirical part of my talk and give you a little overview of the studies that support this idea of augmented iconicity. This is our lab here at our university in our corridor here. And so we have an optical motion capture system, and we place reflective markers on the speaker's hands, and we can measure the movements in terms of the use of space and also their temporal dynamic features. And so this is just a list of what we can look at. First of all, we can visualize those traces, and then we can look at the physical parameters, the distance between two hands. We can measure this to the millimeter, and the distance between the hand and the torso, and also between a certain gesture and a gesture in the temporal distance. We can look at the velocity of gestures, whether there's a certain impetus in the gestural movement, and the degree of finger curvature, which is also interesting because as soon as you have like 0 degrees here in the curvature of a finger, this should be a marked moment in conversation, because the more unmarked version of a hand would be the more relaxed hand. So as soon as you really have a tense and a stretched hand, there should be some meaning being communicated. And yeah, so we can look at a corpus, we can calculate the average velocity and peaks and average distance and some extreme distances between hands, for example. So that is interesting. There's a lot to be done with this, which we haven't been able to do so far. And we can also look at head gestures. That's work by Bela Brenger. And we can look for patterns, top down and bottom up. I will give you some insight of this later. So now I'm going to go through this image iconicity, diagram, and metaphor. So first we'll be looking at augmented image iconicity. And I will present a study that I did some time ago, but this is still quite insightful, in our lab, and we asked 3 native speakers of American English to describe paintings that we showed to them for 60 seconds, and then we took the paintings away and they had to describe them from memory. And so that means that is a different kind of stimulus, a painting, and so that is a visual iconic sign in and of itself. And the question is, what do people pick up from these paintings for their descriptions, multimodal descriptions? And so here you have the painting. This is Paul Klee, The Dance of the Morning Child from 1922. And you have some interesting distribution of weight and in this painting, which I also have analyzed in terms of image schemas, but this is not the main point here. I just would like to show you what we can do with these motion capture plots here. So I'm going to play the video. I hope you can hear it okay. It's not playing. Let's see.
I thought it was a girl because she looked like she was wearing some sort of short flowing skirt, and her head was turned to the side, and I was mirroring what she was doing, and her arms were like this, and her mouth was almost in the shape of a heart, and I kept trying to see if her eyes were open or closed, and it looked like they were just slits. It was really hard to tell.
Okay, so she is depicting in the skirt of the girl in the painting, and she's kind of reenacting the figure or the posture of the girl, and then she's even using her own face in terms of a projection plane to then draw the heart-shaped mouth of the figure and the eye slits. And this is what you can see here on the motion capture plot. This is the flowing skirt. These are the stretched out arms. This is the heart-shaped mouth, and these are the eye slits. So that is quite iconic, even though it's more minimal and a bit schematic, but it's quite iconic, and it's definitely something we could not easily draw from just analyzing the video. So, so you can see here, this maybe shows the mirroring the posture here, and in what way you can see the body on the video here, the bodily posture in action, and you can here see those traces of describing the skirt and the arms. And I looked at this in terms of the image schema balance in the paper Balancing Acts. And so she completely recreates the distribution of weights and also how she, puts most of her weight on this one leg. And most of the time, the speakers use both hands. So what's interesting is that this motion capture plot is balanced. It's not always the case that speakers use both hands, of course, when they gesture or describe something. And here you have this tendency to use both hands and to recreate this balancing act. This is very famous painting, the Angelus Novus, or the Angel of History by Paul Klee. And here, for example, the speaker creates some movement and adds movement to this image in terms of her understanding. This is also interesting in the sense of how people perceive art and understand art and experience art. So this study could also be elaborated in terms of this field of empirical aesthetics. So I'm going to play the clip.
It looks like it's kind of mid-movement, just because the one leg is a little moved and the feathers are sort of swept to one side. Mm-hmm. It does look like it's in the middle of doing something.
In the middle of the movement. And so it's interesting that she cannot see the painting at this point, right? And again, you have the movement traces here. So I'm sure you're getting the idea. And this is the last painting of the tightrope walker. And so here again, this person who can remember so many details from these paintings, she performs a viewpoint shift, and from first describing the background of the painting. So, if you see this white cross here, you can also see it on this motion capture plot. So this is, of course, iconic of those traces. And then she also has some other movement traces here of describing all the different elements here. But she first has this viewpoint of looking at the painting from the outside, and then she suddenly becomes the figure in the painting.
And the background of the picture, there's like a white cross, which is very different from the rest of the picture, which is also like tan, except for the bottom, like it's a little bit darker. It almost looks like it could be green as if it were a cross on a long meadow, whatever. And then on top of that, it looks like a man or some sort of figurine is standing on it, and he's holding something, and he's looking to the side, so it almost looks like he's going like this, because one leg looks more stretched out than the other, and his head is drawn in the face of like a teardrop, so it's very pointed.
So you can see the switch and how she recreates this figure and the whole scenario. And so here it's interesting to see that you have this in terms of image iconicity in the video, these three figures recreating the posture and the distribution of weights. And then in the motion capture plot, you don't see the speakers, and you can draw attention to the movement patterns, and that's a different kind of iconicity. That is sometimes a more reduced image iconicity of the movements, for example, but it is a little bit more diagrammatic, and this already brings me into closer to diagrammatic iconicity. So this is again here you have the body here, the body reenacting the movement, the manner of the movement, as in the wings here, even though this is added to the painting, and then you also have these movement patterns here. Now I would like to show you also a motion event description. So it is close to the Macneilan tradition of motion events, and there's a whole literature, as many of you know, on work on motion events and across languages and speakers and ages and so forth. And this comes from our own lab, and she describes a childhood experience. And since I already gave away this gesture in the beginning, I'm just playing it right away. It's in German, and there's the English translation. So it's a childhood memory. It's a student of architecture, and we ask her to describe an experience of space.
Und wir waren halt ganz oben, und immer wenn ich halt so Kinder musste, dann konnte ich immer die Treppe von oben runtersausen, ganz schnell. Aber diese Treppe, die nahm und nahm und nahm und nahm kein Ende, weil ich eben das Gefühl hatte, dass in einem riesengroßen Turm wohnen. Ja. Genau.
Okay, so she describes this, what she did every morning on her way to kindergarten. So it's a synthesis of many similar motion events. And then you have also these vertical traces here, and that's like the building, or the tower as she calls it, where the apartment of her parents was in. So as I said, here you can have a close look at the motion trace. And so for semioticians, this is who are interested, and also cognitive linguists and other gesture researchers who are interested in looking at the actual gestural form, this gives us an augmented image of the gesture. And then here, some of you have seen this already, the architecture students are very competent in using certain softwares to then turn this motion trace based on the numeric data of our lab into a real sculpture. So this is a 3D printed sculpture. It's like this big, and this is here the iconicity is even more augmented, right? Because it is now a sculpture, and it's an iconic sign in its own right, and you can touch it and you can walk around it. And Ellen Fricke and Jana Bressem and others have organized a gesture exhibition in Berlin, Frankfurt Oder, and Frankfurt, and this was one of our motion sculptures that we presented there, and it was very nice to see this and to have people look at it. All right, so this is not what we do with every gesture, but what is really interesting here as well is, just as a side note, is that this is detached now from the gesture, right? This gesture is kind of part of this person who produced the sculpture, is part of the person who produced it, but it is now an artwork by itself. Diagrammatic iconicity. As you can imagine, with this kind of technology, it is not too difficult to visualize diagrams in the sense that, you know, motion traces that represent relations between things. And so this is work on diagrammatic iconicity in travel planning. So the participants of this study had a task, and they were supposed to agree on a travel itinerary. You know, they had 2 weeks and 5 destinations, and then they had to agree on this. And I will just only give you a very brief excerpt from this. So this is a dialogue. So this is a little different, of course, from just having one person inside of the volume. And so they now, at the end of their negotiations, they sum up, and they have now settled on a certain itinerary from Stockholm to Prague to Kiev and so forth. And so I would like you to look at how they talk to each other. They start drawing some diagrams in the air, you know, from one city to the next. And at some point, the person on the right is turning to her right and draws this final diagram. Always has to, I have to persuade this.
Muss also nicht. Du hast auch für dich, ich war schon im Wasser statt der goldenen Zeche. Großartig. Das ist richtig schön. Können wir auch machen. Pass auf, wir fahren von Stockholm nach Prag. Von Prag nach Kiew. Von da nach unten. Also jetzt sollten wir Kiew relativ zu Prag. Sind auch nicht. Aber gut eingeschätzt. Ich denke, wir fahren dann so, weißt du, von da nach da, rüber, runter und dann nach da und dann wieder nach Hause. Nein? Doch, schön, über Italien.
Well, she wants to go through Italy. Okay, so here you can see this diagram. This is this final part. And what I find particularly interesting is that these are all indexical expressions, you know, from there to there, across, down, and then to there, and then back home again. So that means there is not much content information, right? You need to have all the discourse context in mind in order to understand this part. And while using these indexicals, she's drawing this diagram into the air from Stockholm to Prague to Kiev and back home to Aachen. Okay, so talking about these diagrams of single movement traces, what's interesting is that, or what's challenging is to find patterns. So if you look at this, at these traces, there is no pattern. This is just visualizing those and then freezing those motion traces over 2 minutes of conversation. But we are interested in patterns, and that means we need to look across conversations and speakers, or across moments in discourse. And so what we have done here is that one member of my lab, Matthias Priesters, he created gesture density maps or heat maps. And so he first of all identified the stroke of each gestural movement, and then he created these labs. So this is over a stretch of 20 minutes, you have the hot spots. That means the red spots are those segments of gesture space where the gesturing hands spend most of the time during those 20 minutes. And this is quite stunning from my point of view. I mean, because this is really something that is really difficult to do. Of course, we can, and we used to all do this as gesture researchers, take McNeil's grid and then draw points at where the gesture takes place. And here you can see these heat maps from 4 different speakers. And you can see these different styles in gesturing. So this is you're very focused on the knees, basically. This is a bit distributed. This is, you know, high frequency of gestures and a lot of these hot spots distributed. And this is very much concentrated here in these areas. So that gives us a sense of how people gesture and in terms of using space. And unfortunately, we have not continued this work, but I would love to continue it actually. Now, metaphor iconicity. That means now the subject matter is probably more abstract. This is the last section of the talk. Here I'm drawing on a joint study with Jennifer Hinnell, who is present today, and colleagues here from Aachen, computer scientists. And it's about mapping what we have called here, and also Jennifer, spectral contours in co-speed gesture. And we have an image schema analysis, but what is important here is that we have actually looked at certain movement types when people talk about the idea of a continued or repeated habit. And this comes from Jennifer's work, just to give you an idea of what we were looking for. These are these concatenative auxiliaries, like keep, continue, start, stop, quit, plus a progressive verb form. Things started going good in life, stopped making up stories. I quit doing Botox. I kept getting married. I find these examples really great from Jennifer. And she looked at the little red hen corpus where to see how people talked about this. And I will just show this, what Jennifer and I have also already shown it in other talks, but just to get an idea. This was the baseline for us then to come up with a mocap study. Not easy.
When there's no winner, that jackpot keeps getting higher and higher faster because you've got so many more people buying tickets.
Because if you keep coming back, they keep getting paid. We'll check back with you in a couple of months to find out whether or not it continues to grow.
Okay, so you get an idea of these gestures that highlight this idea of continuation. And so we try to make people use these target structures and constructions. It's not easy, you know, to have people produce exactly what you are looking for. But we had some interviews. We asked them to retell movies and to also talk about their habits and hobbies and cultural conventions. So to have this idea of repeated action. And this is a gesture coding grid by Jana Bressem. So I would like you to here look at the movement types, because this is what we then settled on as a point of departure for the study. So we had these 4 different movement types, also to then, you know, show these examples as a type to our colleagues in the computer science department. And our colleagues then tried to look for all instances of these different movement types. And so they had algorithms already used for other types of multimodal communication, and they adjusted their algorithms to then look through the motion capture data and our gesture data. And just here, I picked this example because I find this regular shape of this gesture quite interesting. This is something that you cannot see with your naked eye, but this tells us something about the nature of gesture. So I'm going to play the clip.
Sensitive to sound, and it's very overstimulating. So if I were to continue watching the movie, like I wouldn't have a problem if the film were to continue.
So this is the movement if I were to continue watching. You see, and here we can see it just with a mocap. So this is interesting in the sense that, yes, we can do an image schema analysis, but here this is a counterfactual, and we do have a progressive verb form. This is what we were looking for. But it's really interesting that this is about something that might happen, and you have this gestural enactment of a hypothesis. So this is interesting in and of itself, and it's a matter for iconicity, that this idea of a process. So our colleagues in the computer science department then looked at these different types, and they created this dissimilarity matrix, and you have the spirals and then the circles and the straights here, and the spirals and the circles and the straights. The blue, dark blue, means that there is a high degree of similarity, because spirals look like spirals, for example, and circles look like circles. But then you also have here's some commonalities between spirals and straights, and that means that you have also a certain extension through space in spirals and in straight movements. So this is captured by this matrix. Okay, so now I'm already almost at the end of my talk. What I was trying to show is that you have, these three types of Persian iconicity help us to identify those different types of iconicity in gesture. And we have different levels of groundedness in terms of these bodily actions, imitating the posture of a figure in a painting, for example, and we have higher degrees of schematicity. And one of my main point is that also mocap helps us to see something about the schematic and the nature of, or different kinds of movement qualities. So you have this iconicity here of the path of the child walking down the staircase, and this is kind of irregular, but there's still this idea of a spiral. And then you have more regular movements in terms of this arc here and the spiral. So here, this is matter for iconicity, and it seems already a little bit more geometric and regular than the image, the image iconicity of a movement path, which is still a synthesis of several motion events. So this is interesting, and this is something I have already tried to describe, and I would like to develop further. And also in terms of the manifestations of the embodied mind. So the idea is that, and this has been shown by other work, of course, that this is a manifestation of the embodied mind in terms of image schemas, metonymy, metaphor, and embodied mind. This is a notion I introduced some time ago, playing around a little bit with this embodiment and exbodiment, meaning that we do have a movement and a movement trace in the gestalt that stays in gesture space, so to speak. And this is different from enacting the bodily action of another person, where where most of the iconicity stays within and in the body. Okay. So the theory part is that, a plaidoyer for a broad concept of iconicity in gesture and different levels of abstraction that I have tried to show out, to point out based on the motion capture images. And of course, empirical research, mocap may bring out qualities of gesture movements that are not easily detectable with the naked eye. So this can help us to better understand both gesture and iconicity. But it's not an easy technology to handle. And of course, we do need the competence of several, disciplines in order to really exploit this technology. And for future work, we would like to use this in a more systematic way and to also do bottom-up pattern recognition and not just top-down. I think this is what we would like the most, to have a corpus and then to have the to find patterns that emerge from the corpus without us predefining certain types. And this is just the last bonbon, so to speak. We have now also created these stick figures based on the videos from our own lab studies. And we have started to show these stick figures as part of the material for brain imaging studies. So we have shown full videos with and without speech and stick figures with and without speech, to then see how differently this is analyzed or what kind of brain activation patterns these differences evoke. So here you can see one more. So you see that you can again draw the attention to these movement qualities in this way without having an actual person being represented. Okay, so I would like to thank my collaborators and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.